When most people decide to break ground on a new garden, they usually start with a mental image that looks a lot like a commercial farm seen from a highway window. You envision those long, straight rows of corn or beans separated by strips of clean, bare earth. It looks orderly, it looks efficient, and it looks like you are in total control. So, you go out to your backyard, till up a patch of grass, and rake that soil until it is perfectly smooth. You plant your seeds in single-file lines like soldiers standing at attention, separating the corn in one bed, the beans in another, and the squash somewhere else entirely. You do this because it is what you have been taught agriculture is supposed to look like. However, by the time July rolls around, that picture of order usually transforms into a massive headache. That bare soil between the rows, which looked so clean in May, is now baked hard by the sun and cracking open, letting moisture escape by the gallon. Or it is covered in weeds that rushed in to fill the void, forcing you to spend your evenings on your knees pulling them out. The plants themselves often look tired, struggling to stand up against the wind, or requiring constant feeding from a bag of fertilizer just to maintain their color. You end up working twice as hard to maintain that separation because you are trying to enforce a rule that nature does not recognize. This struggle is not a reflection of your work ethic. You aren't failing because you aren't watering enough or weeding enough. You are struggling because the industrial model of row farming is designed for tractors, not for living soil systems. In the wild, you never see a plant growing alone, surrounded by bare dirt. Nature fills every inch. More importantly, nature builds communities. Plants have evolved over thousands of years to grow in guilds, groups of different species that grow together, their roots tangling and their leaves overlapping. When you isolate a crop, you strip it of its allies. You force it to fend for itself, which means you, the gardener, have to step in and become the support system. You have to provide the structural support, the nitrogen, and the shade. There is a better way, one that was perfected on this continent long before the first tractor was ever built. It requires us to stop thinking about rows and start thinking about relationships. We need to look at our garden not as a factory floor where we arrange widgets, but as a biological system where each plant has a job to do for the others. When we stop separating these crops and start integrating them, we stop fighting the garden and start letting it work for us. The goal isn't just to grow corn, beans, and squash. The goal is to create a self-sustaining patch of earth where the architecture of the plants themselves solves the problems of water, fertility, and weeds. It starts by forgetting the row and embracing the mound. This method is widely known as the Three Sisters, but I want you to think of it less as a garden technique and more like building a house. When you frame a house, you need a structure to hold it up. You need insulation to keep the temperature right, and you need a way to keep the whole thing running efficiently. If you tried to build a roof without walls or put up walls without a foundation, the house would collapse. The same logic applies here. We are not just planting 3 different vegetables in the same dirt. We are assembling a guild. A guild is simply a group of plants that work together to ensure the survival of the whole group. In this alliance, the corn acts as the vertical structure. In a standard garden, you might pound wooden stakes or set up wire cages to support climbing plants. In this system, the corn is the stake. It grows straight and strong, providing a natural ladder for the beans to climb. It lifts the beans off the damp ground, keeping them away from rot and pests, and it does this without you having to buy a single piece of bamboo or twine. The corn is the backbone. The beans are the nutrition system. Corn is a heavy feeder that pulls a lot of energy from the soil. If you plant corn alone year after year, it leaves the ground depleted and hungry. But beans have a special ability that most plants do not. They can pull nitrogen, a critical fertilizer, right out of the air and fix it into the soil through their roots. They essentially pay rent for the trellis the corn provides. While the corn reaches high, the beans are working below the surface, feeding the very earth that supports the corn. It is a cycle of give and take. Then there is the squash. The squash is the protective layer, the living mulch. If you have ever grown pumpkins or winter squash, You know they have massive, wide leaves that are rough to the touch. In this guild, the squash sprawls along the ground, creating a dense canopy over the soil. This shade keeps the sun from baking the earth, locking in the cool moisture that the thirsty corn needs. But it does more than just shade. The prickly stems and leaves act as a physical barrier. Raccoons and other critters that might want to raid your corn stalks don't like walking through that tangle of prickly vines. The squash defends the perimeter. When you put these three together, you stop seeing them as individual crops competing for space and start seeing a machine. The corn lifts, the bean feeds, and the squash protects. You aren't forcing them to coexist. You are restoring a partnership that has worked for thousands of years. This shift in perspective is the most important tool you have. Once you understand that the plants are trying to help each other, your job changes. You stop being the dictator of the garden and start being the facilitator. You are simply setting the stage for them to do what they already know how to do. So, how do we actually begin? We don't start by tilling a massive rectangle. We start with a single mound. This is the foundation of the entire system. In a traditional row garden, the soil is flat, which means it stays cold longer in the spring and can get waterlogged during heavy rains. But we are building a microclimate. We want to scrape the soil together to form a flat-topped hill. You want this mound to be substantial, about 4 to 5 feet across at the base and roughly 10 to 12 inches high. Think of it less like a sharp pyramid and more like a low plateau. There is a practical reason for this shape. By raising the soil up, you are improving drainage immediately. Water will flow away from the stems of your plants, preventing rot during those wet spring weeks. But more importantly, a mound warms up faster than flat ground. The sun hits the sides and the top, raising the soil temperature earlier in the season. Corn is a heat-loving crop. It doesn't like cold feet. By giving it this warm, elevated platform, you are tricking the corn into thinking summer has arrived a little earlier than it actually has. Once you have your mound shaped and the top flattened out, it is time for the first sister to enter. This is where patience is tested. A lot of folks get excited and want to put all the seeds in the ground on the same Saturday afternoon. If you do that, the system will fail. The beans will grow faster than the corn, swarm it, and pull it down before it ever has a chance to stand tall. The corn must go first. It needs a head start on the flat top of your mound. You aren't going to plant a single seed. Corn is wind-pollinated. It needs to be close to other corn stalks to produce a full ear. If you plant one stalk, you get no corn. So, we plant in a circle. Mark a circle about 2 feet in diameter right on top of that mound. Along the perimeter of that circle, plant about 6 to 8 corn seeds. Space them evenly. Push them down about an inch into the soil and cover them up. Now you wait. This is the hardest part for a new gardener. You have to let the weeks pass. You are watching for germination, watching for those first green shoots to poke through. You need that corn to establish a strong root system and a thick, sturdy stalk. We are looking for height here. We generally wait until the corn is about 6 inches tall, roughly hand-high, before we even think about introducing the next sister. This head start ensures that the corn is always physically ahead of the beans, maintaining its role as the dominant structural support. Until that corn is knee-high to a grasshopper, the other seeds stay in the packet. Once your corn is standing about 6 inches to a foot tall, strong enough that it isn't swaying helplessly in a light breeze, it is time to introduce the second sister. This usually happens about 2 to 3 weeks after you put the corn in the ground, depending on how warm your spring has been. This timing is the difference between success and a tangled mess. If the beans go in too early, they will drag the corn down. If they go in too late, they won't have time to ripen. We are looking for that sweet spot where the corn has established its dominance in the mound. When you go to the store to buy your seeds, you need to be careful. You are looking specifically for pole beans. Do not buy bush beans. Bush beans are bred to stay low and compact. They are convenient for mechanical harvesting, but in a guild, they are useless. We need climbers. We need beans that have the instinct to reach for the sky. Planting the beans is simple, but precision matters. You aren't just scattering them. You want to plant the beans evenly around the circle of corn you already established. I typically plant 4 to 6 bean seeds in the mound, placing them in the gaps between the corn stalks. You want them about 3 inches away from the corn plants. This proximity is vital. When that bean sprout breaks the surface and sends out its first seeking tendril, it needs to find the corn stalk immediately. If it's too far away, it will crawl along the ground and get lost. We want it to hit that vertical corn stalk and instinctively start to spiral upward. As the season progresses, you will see the bean vines wrapping tightly around the corn. This actually reinforces the corn. A lone stalk of corn is vulnerable to high wind. It can snap or get pushed over. But when you have corn stalks tied together by strong fibrous bean vines, they act like a single woven unit. They hold each other up. The corn supports the bean, and the bean anchors the corn. While this visible structural work is happening above ground, the second sister is doing her most important work underground. This is the part that changed how I view soil. Corn is a heavy feeder and a glutton for nitrogen. It will strip your soil of fertility in a single season if you let it. Beans, however, are nitrogen fixers through a relationship with bacteria in the soil. Bean roots can actually pull nitrogen out of the air and convert it into a form that plants can use. They are essentially manufacturing fertilizer from thin air and depositing it right at the roots of the hungry corn. The corn provides the lift and the beans provide the lunch. It is a closed loop of support that requires zero input from you. About a week after the beans have sprouted, or roughly when they start looking for that corn stalk to grab onto, we bring in the third sister. This is the squash. You can use pumpkins, winter squash, or even gourds, but you want a vining variety, not a bush type. We aren't planting these in the circle with the corn and beans. If we did, they would crowd the center and cut off airflow. Instead, we plant the squash seeds around the perimeter of the mound, right on the sloping shoulders or just at the base. The squash is the living mulch. In a standard garden, you might haul in bags of wood chips or straw to cover the bare dirt. Here, the plant does the work for you. As the squash grows, it doesn't climb, it crawls. It sends big, broad leaves outward, covering the soil surrounding the mound. These leaves act like an umbrella. They block the sunlight from hitting the dirt, which does 2 things. First, it stops weeds from germinating because they can't get any light to grow. Second, and most importantly, it keeps the soil cool and moist. Corn is thirsty. By covering the ground, the squash ensures that the water you give the garden stays in the ground rather than evaporating into the summer air. But the squash offers one more layer of defense. Armor. If you have ever walked through a pumpkin patch in shorts, you know that squash vines are covered in stiff, prickly hairs. They are uncomfortable to touch. Well, hungry critters like raccoons don't like them either. Raccoons are smart and they love sweet corn, but they have sensitive paws. They generally won't cross a barrier of prickly squash vines to get to the corn stalks in the center. So, by planting the squash on the outside, you are building a prickly fortress wall around your precious harvest. The corn lifts, the bean feeds, and the squash protects. The guild is now complete. Now we enter the dog days of summer. This is usually the time when the romance of gardening wears off for most people. The heat is oppressive, the bugs are out in force, and the weeds in a traditional row garden are growing faster than you can pull them. But this is where the Three Sisters Guild begins to shine. This is the moment where you step back and realize that you built a system that largely takes care of itself. The rhythm of your work shifts from active building to passive observation. You aren't forcing the garden to grow anymore. You are just watching it work. The first thing you will notice is the water. In a standard row garden with exposed dirt, you might be out there every evening with a hose trying to keep the soil from turning into dust. But walk over to your mound, stick your finger through the canopy of squash leaves and touch the soil. Even on a hot July afternoon, that dirt will likely feel cool and damp. That squash armor is doing its job. Because of this, you don't need to water nearly as often. When you do water, you water deeply, soaking the base of the mound so the roots chase that moisture down. But you aren't fighting a daily battle against evaporation. You are working with a reservoir, not a sieve. Visually, the mound is going to change, and this can be jarring if you are used to neat lines. It is going to look wild. It is going to look like a tangle of green chaos. The beans will be hanging off the corn like ornaments. The squash vines will be climbing over each other, and you might not be able to see the ground at all. Don't panic. This is what abundance looks like. A tidy garden is often a barren one. A messy garden is usually teeming with life. Resist the urge to prune it back or clean it up. Let the vines sprawl. Let the leaves overlap. That density is exactly what protects the crops from scorching sun and high winds. Your maintenance tasks are minimal. Now, you might need to guide a wayward bean tendril back to a cornstalk if it starts wandering off. You might see a persistent weed poke through the squash leaves. Just pull it out. There won't be many. Mostly you are checking for health. You are looking at the color of the corn leaves. Are they a deep, rich green? That means the beans are fixing enough nitrogen. Is the corn standing straight after a thunderstorm? That means the roots are anchored. You have moved from being the laborer to being the manager. You have trusted the plants to do their jobs, and now they are repaying that trust with resilience. You can sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea and look at that mound, knowing that while the row gardener down the street is sweating over a hoe, your garden is quietly thriving on its own terms. As the days get shorter and the air turns crisp, the guild offers up its bounty. But unlike a grocery store trip, this harvest doesn't happen all at once. It is a slow, deliberate unfolding that respects the different rhythms of the plants. First, you might take the winter squash. You wait until the vines have withered and the stems turn corky and dry, signaling that the fruit has hardened off and is ready to sit on your pantry shelf for months. Then come the beans. If you planted dry beans for storage, you listen for the rattle. When the pods are brown and brittle, you shell them out, holding a handful of protein that will feed your family when the snow is flying. Finally, the corn. If you grew flour or flint corn, you leave it standing until the husks are paper dry, gathering the last of the summer's energy. You are gathering more than just calories. You are gathering security. However, the most critical moment of the entire year happens after you have carried the baskets inside. This is where most modern gardeners make their final mistake. They look at the garden now, brown, withered, and tangled, and they see a mess that needs to be cleaned up. They go out with heavy gloves, rip the corn stalks out by the roots, tear up the bean vines, and haul it all away to a compost pile. Or worse, put it in bags for the city to take. They treat the crop residue like trash. But you need to look at those dead plants and see a bank account. Those corn stalks are dense carbon. Those bean roots left underground are still holding on to little nodules of nitrogen. The squash leaves are rich organic matter. If you rip them out and haul them away, you are robbing the soil of the very nutrients it spent all season creating. You are breaking the cycle. Instead of cleaning up, I want you to practice what we call chop and drop. Take a pair of sharp shears and cut the corn stalks and bean vines right at the soil level. Do not pull the roots up. Leave them in the ground to rot. As they decompose over the winter, they will release that nitrogen and create microscopic tunnels for air and water to penetrate the dense earth. Take the stalks and vines you cut down, chop them into manageable pieces, and lay them right back down on top of the mound. You are essentially tucking the garden in for bed. You are rebuilding the mulch layer. Over the winter, the snow and rain will break that material down, returning those nutrients directly into the mound. You aren't just taking from the land, you are closing the loop. When spring comes, you won't need to till. You won't need to buy bags of fertilizer. You will walk out to a mound that is soft, rich, and ready to begin again. I know what you are thinking. You are looking at your backyard and you are doing the math. You are calculating how many mounds you can fit, how many bushels of corn you can store, and how much money you can save at the grocery store this year. You are ready to go all in. I am going to ask you to do the hardest thing possible. Stop. Do not till up your whole yard. Do not buy 5 pounds of seed corn. If you try to manage 20 mounds your first year, you will get overwhelmed. The weeds will win, and you will walk away thinking the system doesn't work. Instead, I want you to start with just 1 mound. Find a sunny spot in the corner of your yard, maybe a patch of grass that is just 4 feet by 4 feet. That is all you need. Build 1 mound. Plant 1 circle of corn. Tend 1 family of plants. This approach changes the stakes. If you make a mistake, if you plant the beans too early and they pull the corn down, or if the squash beetles find you, you haven't lost your winter food supply. You have simply learned a lesson on a small scale. You can stand over that single mound and really observe what is happening. You can learn the timing of your specific climate without the pressure of managing a farm. You are giving yourself permission to learn the rhythm before you try to play the song. Gardening is not a race. It is a lifelong relationship with the land. If you succeed with 1 mound this year, you will have the confidence and the seeds to plant 3 mounds next year, then 5, then 10. The goal is not to become independent from the grocery store by October. The goal is to build a skill set that lasts the rest of your life. So, put down the rototiller, go grab a shovel, and just make 1 mound. That is how every legacy begins. If this ancient wisdom has changed the way you see the plants in your backyard, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history that was nearly forgotten. Plant your future today. The next treasure of the earth will be revealed soon.